Hi, welcome to Plagiarism and Trustworthy Sources for Grade 12. My name is Miss Rowland, and I'm a teacher at Springfield Central High School. I know that you've already received a lot of lessons on plagiarism. This last one is going to be focused specifically on what you need to know before you leave us at Central and start at college. Why are we always talking about plagiarism and copyright? Here's why it's important. So we sent out a survey to recent Central graduates to ask them about their research paper experience while they're at college their freshman year. Now, we received the responses back, and these students attended everywhere from UMass to Western New England, Springfield College, Providence College, Westfield State, and HCC and STCC. All of them, no matter what they were majoring in, reported they were assigned at least one research paper in their very first semester. So here's an example of one of those research papers, and you can kind of take a look and see what's there, but you'll notice it pretty much asks for everything that we ask from you in the 11th and 12th grade research papers, everything from a variety of sources, to use trustworthy sources, to use MLA style, to make sure that you use citation when you're paraphrasing or quoting, and to include a works cited page. Now, what's interesting is that all of these students told us that they received no instruction on how to write that research paper in the class. The professor just assumed that the students knew how to do research, knew how to find trustworthy sources, knew how to create in-text citations, so on and so forth. And all of them were assessed on both how they selected reliable sources and their proper citation format and creation of a bibliography. So that's why we're always drilling it with you, because it may be that your professors in college are not going to go over this with you. That being said, the other thing you should be aware of is many colleges will use online anti-plagiarism tools. Starting in fall of 2021, Central will be using Turnitin. A lot of colleges use Turnitin. It's probably the most popular of the anti-plagiarism software, but there are others. And basically the way they work is students are required to turn in their papers directly through this software. The software not only compares it to everything that is digital on the web, everything from articles and databases to online papers for sale to just regular old websites, and it checks for plagiarism. But it also checks the papers against every other paper that's been turned in to that software. Meaning, if a friend of yours wrote a paper and says, hey, you can just turn in my paper to your class, that's not going to work because the Turnitin software or whatever software your college is using is going to pick it up. More and more often, colleges or universities are using that same software for admissions essays to make sure that people aren't using other people's essays. So it's getting more and more important that you understand what plagiarism is and how to avoid it. Plagiarism is thought to be the worst academic crime that you can commit. Therefore, colleges and universities will have some sort of academic honesty guide for students, and this is always provided in the student handbook. This one happens to be from UMass, but it's pretty similar to most colleges in the area. And if you take a look down, I'm not going to go through every single one of these pointers, but you can see it's everything from if you were to paraphrase and not cite, to if you were to turn in the same paper to 2 or more classes, 2, if you work in groups and you weren't given permission to work in groups to come up with a project. So a lot of these things students aren't aware would be considered academically dishonest. So we want to make you aware of them now. The one that comes up the most is obviously plagiarism in any sort of paper writing. So we want to make sure that you understand how to avoid it. What are some consequences for plagiarism? Well, as you know, we went over this in 11th grade. You can lose credit for the assignment. You might actually lose credit for the entire course. You may even be suspended or expelled from that university. You can also be placed on academic probation. And either way, oftentimes you will lose your scholarship, even if it's not academically based. More importantly, though, you do lose your respect and trust from your professors. Now, your professors are going to be people in the field that you're going to want to network with in order to get a job outside of college. So it's really important that you keep their respect and their trust. In the workforce, if you commit any sort of academic dishonesty, any sort of copyright violation, the punishment can be anything from losing your job, being demoted, possibly being sued, but also just a loss of your reputation. And it's very difficult to get another position of importance in your field if you've been found guilty or even accused of plagiarism or copyright violation. So it can be a very serious charge. How can you avoid plagiarism? We've been telling you this since 9th grade. Just make sure that anything you take from an outside source, whether it be something you get on the internet, you get in a database, you get in a book, if you interview someone, if you get it from a movie, if it didn't come from your own head, make sure you give credit to where it came from. And that's as simple as creating a works cited page for MLA, or if you're in the sciences, create a references list. Once you create that list, you're going to notice that the first word is kind of hanging out. That's because it's called a hanging indent. And it's done that way, formatted that way on purpose, so that it's very easy to see the first two words in each entry. And that's because that's what you're going to use in parentheses after that fact, idea, or direct quotation that you take from that source. And that's as simple as it gets, guys. Create that list of sources, and then anything you get from each one of those sources, put those first words, word or words, from the works cited entry in parentheses at the end of the sentence, follow it by the period, and you've covered yourself. The other aspect I want to go over, though, in this presentation quickly is the concept of a trustworthy source. Now, we've talked and talked and talked about reliable sources over the last 4 years, but I just want to reiterate how important it is to remember to use a trustworthy source, especially in college. I have here snippets of research papers that were given to our central graduates at their respective colleges in their first semester in college. And I want to show you that each one of them mentions that they have to use a trustworthy source in one way or another. So this first one actually specifies that all of the sources have to come from the database that that college uses. We use a lot of different databases here at Central, and we've shown you the Boston Public Library database, but this one in particular wants their students to use Academic Search Premier and limits them to only using sources from that database. This next paper, and you may get some sort of version of this at your college or university, where a professor will give you one of the texts or will give you one or two texts and say, you need to add 3 or 4 more in addition to this. Here's an example of that, but you'll notice that even so, even though the professor specifies you have to use this, he or she does mention that you need to use trustworthy sources. You can't use things like Cliff Notes or Spark Notes or Book Rags or any of those. This professor, it's an English class, is specifying that students must use this text, and then have to find other sources, but they have to be trustworthy, reliable academic sources. They can't be sort of these cheat sheets that are thrown together online. And this last example, you'll notice the professor specifies the same things that we specify, that we want it to be 3 to 4 pages, 12-point font, Times New Roman, 1-inch margins, double spacing, right? Yada, yada. However, note what the professor writes. Use academic historical sources. If you cite from history.com, Shmoop, Wikipedia, biography.com, or any of the associated websites, you will automatically receive a 0 on the assignment. Why? Now, it's not that these sources are necessarily untrue. You've heard me talk about why Wikipedia is untrustworthy in the past. Biography and history.com tend to be a little bit better, but they're not classified as academic sources, meaning they're kind of what I like to refer to as everyman sources, meaning they're written at a level that everyone can understand whether or not he or she is a scholar or not. But in college, they want you to use academic sources. So that would be things like articles from journals, things in the database, perhaps something even from Google Scholar, but not from these everyman, very easy, watered down sources. So what rules can you follow to make sure that you're using trustworthy sources? First and foremost, if your professor or your teacher gives you sources, use them, okay? Don't make it more difficult for yourself. Use the sources that he or she has provided. However, beyond that, your first course of action that always works is stick to a database. This could be the Boston Public Library database, it could be the Gale database, it could be your college's collection of databases. Every college library has one. Here's why. All of the articles in that database have been vetted. They are trustworthy, they are reliable, and they tend to be more academic rather than everyman sources. Second, if you're going to use something online, use digital versions of newspapers or magazines that you recognize. New York Times, The Washington Post, Time Magazine. Third, if you do use the internet, if you're allowed to and you choose to use the internet and not a database, utilize an academic search engine. Google Scholar works. It definitely works. And what's nice about Google Scholar is you almost always get the abstract, which is kind of the summary of the article. So you have an idea if it's going to work for you. But even broader than that, try RefSeek. RefSeek works exactly like Google. So it's just refseek.com and you type in what you're searching for. And try to stick to the .edus and the .govs because they tend to be the sources that are A, more academic, B, more apt to be vetted and trustworthy. That's all from me today. If you have any other questions about avoiding plagiarism and trustworthy sources, please don't hesitate to drop me a line. My email address is on the screen.